Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sherry Heinisch, also called the Supply Chain Queen, joined with co-host James George. Today, we're asking a deceptively simple question for big idea number 9. How does clean energy actually power industrialization in the global south? Not in theory, not in policy papers, but in practice. When you're navigating and balancing African sovereignty priorities, European corporate platforms, outside investment in multilateral finance, and the reality that this is an infrastructure that must be built, these are communities that must be empowered. Our guest today has lived on both sides. James Mnyupe helped architect Namibia's green hydrogen strategy as the country's first hydrogen commissioner, building the blueprint for African-led clean industrialization. Now, as Senior Vice President for Sub-Saharan Africa at ThyssenKrupp, he's implementing it at scale. This conversation explores sovereignty, partnership, and who captures value in the new clean energy economy. I'm so happy to see you. We caught up after New York Climate Week, but we originally met at Unstoppable Africa, and I was just so impressed by your keynote panel and then your breakout session. I was like, this guy.
She knows how to warm up a candidate before they go on TV. Now I'm feeling like he can do anything.
I mean,
okay, this guy.
She's not the number one supply chain professional to know 2025 for no reason, right? Like, this is why we're here with Sherry, just to get the tidbits of her information, to hang on our coattails as she takes us through these conversations. But I also feel watching your TED Talk, James, and reading some of the documentation in preparation for this, I feel like I'm wedged between, I usually say a rose between two thorns, but I think I'm wedged between two giants here, right? Trying to transform your respective industries. So it's going to be a fantastic conversation.
So JG, how were you snapped up by Sherry's charm and amazingness? Like, what happened to you? I don't know what happened to me, but you know,
I've known Sherry for probably getting on 6 years now, Sherry? 7 years?
6 years. We've known each other through different jobs. You were at Ellen MacArthur Foundation when we met.
Yeah, that's when we first met. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And then we've just sort of stayed in each other's orbits.
IBM. We partnered together at IBM through Pixera Global.
Yeah.
We've done events together. We did a keynote together for Earth Day, Sustainability Live. Remember that?
Yes, I did. Yeah, it was on my birthday.
James, we've known each other for a while.
We have.
He's gotten married. He's had children.
Yeah, exactly. We've
That's
shared
a lot of knowing each other, man. I'm like, but if you've lasted this long, this can only mean well for me, JG.
I don't know why I'm still here. Like, you know.
And I'll tell you an interesting fun fact. We've even done some impromptu karaoke singing.
What?
We have.
Is this on the internet? I'm Googling right now.
No, not on the internet.
Was that in Atlanta?
It was in Atlanta. It was at GreenBiz Circularity.
GreenBiz Circularity, like
2022.
22, Jeebus.
Yeah.
Wow.
But James, this is all about you.
Yes.
This is all about you. I would love to just open, for folks that don't know James, what rock have you been hiding under, first of all?
Right.
You need to watch his TED Talk. You need to connect with him on LinkedIn. James, why don't you tell listeners a little bit about yourself, your journey?
No, fantastic. My new role at ThyssenKrupp is an interesting one. I think the job is really to kind of try and champion green industrialization for, let's call it a European conglomerate that wants to be a great global citizen. Essentially, what I'm trying to do now is look after 49 countries and then get to know those countries' goals and aspirations from a policy perspective, and then align and match that with our own capabilities in terms of techno-economic capability. And then along the way, we would love to sort of mobilize fit-for-purpose capital to make the dreams and aspirations of those countries come true. And, you know, these dreams and aspirations could have anything to do with fertilizer and food security all the way to mineral beneficiation and beyond, because ThyssenKrupp is just such a sort of broad conglomerate.
Yeah, and before the ThyssenKrupp role, you were Namibia's first Commissioner of Green Hydrogen and Special Economic Advisor. So incredible impact. Again, the TED Talk unpacks some of that impact. Can you tell us a little bit about that role as well?
No, absolutely. I think, to be honest, September 2020 till today, or I'll call it until March 2025, has been a redonkulous roller coaster. I hope your users are okay with me calling it redonkulous, just because it's been so humbling, but at the same time, it's taken me all the way from meeting young school children in Lüderitz to sort of Prince Albert of Monaco in Glasgow COP 2026 and back, right? And what it entailed is working extremely closely with a very, very visionary president to put in place, let's call it, probably one of Namibia's most innovative and cutting edge efforts to really incubate new industries that just never existed, all really sort of built around Namibia's amazing renewable energy endowment. And at the same time, the fact that we're a peaceful nation allows us to mobilize very, very interesting, cheap capital as well. But at the core of the whole effort was really economic diplomacy that really was very hard to match, given that the president was the same individual who actually architected Namibia's constitution, right? And he's been working at this, or he was working at this since the 1960s. And so it was really amazing to be able to engage world leaders from around the globe in trying to put in place what at the time was an unprecedented move by an African nation to industrialize in a clean way.
And may he rest in power.
Absolutely.
And I was gonna pick up on that thread a little bit there, James, if you don't mind, because I guess you've had an incredible journey to get to this stage, as you just sort of highlighted, and I love the way you articulate part of that journey through the narrative of making lemonade in the TED Talk, designing Namibia's strategy as the hydrogen commissioner, now implementing work with industrial partners, platforms, bringing that blueprint to life as you move forward. I guess from your experience, and this is quite topical, I think, in 2025, when we think about, I mean, it's incredibly reductive to call it kind of global north and global south, but when we think, how do you navigate those tensions between European commercial interests and African industrial sovereignty?
Yeah. And I mean, this is for me where, it got so interesting that I've decided this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, right? So for the next 2 to 3 decades, I want to essentially codify industrialization and geopolitics and then sort of really break that down for African leaders and give them a blueprint or at least a pathway of making, like really strategic, intellectually infused decisions, right? Because, you talk about Europe and Africa, but there's actually, the way I looked at it, really 4 parts of the world. There was, let's call it China or the Far East, that has really sort of gotten a hold of how to valorize minerals, mobilize clean energy. Some people calling it the electrotech revolution. So the East and China really own that. You've got the Europeans in the middle, it's the largest economic trading bloc in the world, but they're also really aspiring consumers of clean goods, right? Goods that have a low carbon signature. And then, of course, you sort of have now the sort of new identification of the US being this really strong anchor for hydrocarbons and maybe wanting to build a new, I don't know, like industrial order, I think. And then you've got Africa, which I think has a choice, right? That sort of says, look, I've got all these clean minerals, I've got an abundance of clean energy. How exactly do I play is maybe an interesting word, but how do I navigate, right, these geopolitical giants and their aspirations and craft an outcome and a strategy that serves my interests as well? Not only do I have the minerals and the energy, but I also have this youthful population, and we're probably going to be one of the largest markets, at least from a people perspective, in the next few decades.
Yeah.
And I think that was really what we were trying to go after, right? Was, yes, knowing our gifts and our talents, but most importantly, once you start to understand your market, and your market could be Europe because you want to sell to them, but your market could even be China for all that matters, because they want to deploy some of their goods with you, but they also want to buy some of your minerals, right? And so understanding all of that is, I think, absolutely key to industrializing in a way that is aware of the underlying techno-economics. And then, of course, making sure that your goods has an identity, a fingerprint. And this is where the work with the supply chain queen for me is like super exciting. How do we make sure that our products are uniquely categorized, labeled, etc., so that they can fetch, right, like an appropriate price for the effort that we've put in making them unique as well. So I think that's really where this becomes really, really exciting.
And if I can just pull on that thread just a little bit more, is, I guess everyone talks about partnership, right? When we think about these big kind of industrial relationships, but not all partnerships are created equal. So how do you make sure in those conversations that it is a genuine win-win and it's not just one side taking advantage of the other?
So, I think let me practically tell you how we did it, right? And of course, we want to learn and do it better. But step number one was, our president called probably 4 of the preeminent private sector players in Namibia, right? And said, I want you to join the administration one way or another. One became the central bank governor. One became the head of the investment promotion agency. I was brought into the private office to become economic advisor. Now, these 3 individuals, are like PhD holders now, CFA charter holders. So president brought like very atypical expertise right into the heart of economic strategy formulation, number one. Number two, the first thing I did, I came from buy-side asset management, is I infused 3 Bloomberg terminals into the presidency. Now, that level of cutting edge intelligence and information just didn't exist before in government, right? But what that did is it allowed us to start knowing our clients really, really deeply. And, KYC from a banking perspective is, what is Sherry's sort of source of income and this sort of thing. But when I say know your client, I meant really understand what RED 3 meant from an EU perspective. What did CBAM mean? And what was the Belt and Road Initiative all about? And what was the IRA, right, in the US all about? Once you start to really understand not just the policy directive and what it means, but how does it relate to, for example, national security, right? And of course, global dominance from a manufacturing perspective. Once you knew what they wanted, you can obviously understand better what you would want in a relationship. It's a little bit like dating, but just with a few more complicated missiles and tariffs and all that kind of stuff. But once you knew each other, it became a little bit easier, right? To negotiate, to interact, and to trade. And I think the core thing though was intelligence, techno-economic capability embedded in the heart of the vision. And then from there, we tried to cascade it down into 3 different things. We organized government, cabinet ministers, etc., into a Green Hydrogen Council. We organized academia to make sure that our R&D and our children were being, sort of skilled and educated and infused with intelligence about what those countries wanted and what we would want. Of course, we organized industry as well. We formed something called the Namibian Green Hydrogen Association, which meant that industry's voice was not fragmented and they had a clear pathway into making sure that whatever government was sort of dreaming about was at least practical, right? And was going to be serving real job creation, gross fixed capital formation. And then really after doing that, it was execution in a very sort of transaction-focused manner, right? So we're not just doing this for ideology, we're doing this to get this particular deal over the line, make sure it's bankable, reduce the cost of capital, make sure you've got strategic offtake, and then all the other bells and whistles around it, ECAs, da. And you put together 3 or 5 transactions like that, and you began to have a blueprint, a movement, and you then solve for things like local content policy, etc.
Yeah, and James, what I love in what you've just described for folks listening is we talk a lot about value chain, but what is the real value creation that happens in the execution of this vision and blueprint? And how can we transition what the paradigm shift is from classically what we would describe as decolonizing resilience and keeping value and intellectual capital within Africa and it not feeling and being extractive. Everyone who's listening knows the history, particularly around colonialism. And we've covered this in Big Idea number 5, by the way. We spoke with one of India's most distinguished scientists, and he says he dabbles as an economics, but he's written several very popular books. And similar themes that he's described. The question that I have, and you and I have talked about this, you mentioned bankable project.
Absolutely.
And so when you think about redefining what bankable is on African terms, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, that is such a loaded question, but that's why we came with
Okay, you can just dip your toe in the water.
Let's do it, right? It's maybe the first of many conversations, and I'm sure, and we'll unpack it in the work that we do. Bankability, a big part of that is risk management. So you take Qatar, the Middle East, they discover, say, hydrocarbons. They didn't necessarily go and build it all on their own the first time around, right? They did work with partners in the beginning to de-risk the ecosystem, and later on, they went on to own more and more and more of the value chain. If you think of Saudi Aramco today, it used to be called, I think, the Californian Oil Company or something like this. And gradually the Saudis bought out the US, right? And so today, when I was trying to build some of these assets, or at least trying to encourage some of those assets to be constructed in Namibia, you can imagine if I went to Mizuho Bank in Japan and I said, give me $250 million for Namibia to build a directed use iron ore plant in Usakos or Arandis, for example, they would have said, what, where, right? But what we did is we brought in private sector people that these banks and, these multilaterals knew. We made sure, for example, that as we were mobilizing grants from our economic partners, because we knew what they wanted and they were willing to give us these grants, we designed that when these private sector champions came to build these assets, they were embedding, for example, our universities into their pilot projects. And therefore, our students were becoming part of the designing and the crafting of these solutions, right? Because slowly but surely, you then start to, people talk about technology transfer. People will not just give you technology. Embed yourself in the way that you craft the solutions from day one. So that was one. The other, of course, is, you design smart local content policies, right? To make sure you say, hey, Hyphen, you want to build a project in Namibia? Well, 30% of this content should be local, but I understand that that's an ambitious target. Let's do an independent baseline study to establish what may be possible and what may not be possible, and then we can negotiate from there. But the intent early on was we want, transportation, construction, basic things should be able to be done by Namibians. But I think, to your point, the key thing here is to get us involved in crafting the solutions from an early stage and then gradually increasing our participation and, the infusion of our own champions into the delivery of these projects. I'll give you one more example. We have a local port authority called Namport. And what we ended up doing was we looked at for the largest shipping company. We put together a tender, but they won a tender to build a container terminal. We went and engaged the largest port operator in the world, in Europe, and the second largest. And we gave those three parties different assets to develop in partnership with our port authority. Think about what that means in terms of A, mobilizing expertise and intelligence about how the world works, but two, we started mobilizing capital, Cherie, that is below the cost of capital of the whole nation, right? Because Namibia is not investment grade, but MSC, Port of Rotterdam, Port of Antwerp are all AAA rated entities. And so all of us, we are building infrastructure at a cost of capital that is even better than our own sovereign, right? And then over time, we build that capability and we can start building some of our own assets as well. But, so you can see bankability is a bit of an art, right? It's a dance between inviting big players that can bring good capital and capability, but making sure that you're in the driver's seat and learning and gathering as much information as possible as you grow your own capability over time.
It's brilliantly articulated by you. De-risking the cost of capital. Unstoppable Africa, you talked a little bit about this, and a lending rate of 17% at scale doesn't scale. It's also not fair, and you don't want African governments and African communities to be subsidizing European or foreign profits at the penalty of the community. James and I in the past have talked about future economic resilience and putting communities at the center of that. And I think, James, what you probably didn't read it or you don't know about it, but you've just beautifully articulated one of the key things that we started talking about many, many moons ago. Circularity is a piece of that, especially in advanced manufacturing and distribution, and also the future of skills. And so I think it's a beautiful vision to really empower people to have purpose, to feel connected to what's happening around them. And certainly Africa is the innovation stomping ground, leapfrogging a lot of these clean energy investments that are happening in other parts of the world. JG, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just curious that, obviously you're almost on the other side of the fence now with sort of ThyssenKrupp. From a corporate perspective, you're sat in a different chair. So what stays non-negotiable, right? What are those points that you can't compromise on, even if there is those commercial, the
Yeah. This is a really interesting theme for me every day I wake up, right? That will closely sort of collaborate with, the EU Commission and many other players like that. But that has global ambitions, right? And so, for example, this particular company has ambitions to actually learn a lot from Asia, right? And wants strategic partnerships with China, but at the same time is also trying to build assets in the US, South America, and Africa for that matter. So from that perspective, you are probably in a platform that is global in nature with the many, many lessons that you can derive, but also they've given me an extremely sort of, let's call it, relevant mandate, right? Which is, hey, take these 49 countries or this region and let's see how we can really, really bring it to the fore in terms of its unlocking its potential. And so I think the mandates are mutually aligned or are symbiotic in many different ways, because the assets that we're building for Dangote, right, in terms of a urea plant, 4 trains of urea in Nigeria, and for example, in Ethiopia, are actually fitting and learning from the Kafco plants and the Sabi plants that we built for Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example. And so I think the onus really is on me as an African to say, what can we learn from this 3,300 plant that we built in Saudi Arabia, and how can we replicate that for Africa's most industrial person, but at the same time working with the Angolan government and the Zambian government to replicate those lessons. So I think that's one. The second goes back to what we've already talked about, which is bankability. If, JG and myself came up and wanted to build an ammonia plant in Namibia or Angola or Zambia or something like this, the banks would get a little bit nervous. If a company that has been doing this since 1921 said that they wanted to do that, and, the banks have financed many, many different plants that this company has done, and these assets are working, it reduces the perceived risk of delivering an asset like this in Africa, right?
yeah.
So I think you got to make the most of that. But for me, I think the part that becomes really, really interesting is, okay, so now you're building a urea plant in some African nation, and this is where I'd love to do more work with the supply chain queen. What makes this particular ammonia plant in Zambia or Angola, which is actually next to a hydroelectricity plant, what makes that different from the one that is using natural gas in Saudi Arabia, right? And clearly, the carbon content is different, but how do you actually measure that? How do you certify that? And therefore, how do you market that product differentiately from another one that is being done around the world? Because the techno-economic and the engineering is one thing, but the narrative, the marketing, and the value realized for that same molecule of ammonia or that urea granule can be very different. And this is where I think as Africans, we really need to step it up and take a leaf out of Safaricom and start leapfrogging how we unlock value relative to other parts of the world. Because by definition, if you're developing, right, and you want to catch up, you have to do some things better, faster, and or leapfrog specific processes to make good relative progress. So this is, for me, one of the really exciting things I want to unlock on the.
Absolutely. And James, what you've just unpacked for listeners is digital infrastructure as sovereignty enabling. When you think about the importance of data infrastructure and how that would power exponential technologies like digital twinning in manufacturing and production and even distribution, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about AI, the application of agentic AI or frontier AI, all of these things working in concert will allow Africa owning the IP, owning the value creation, owning digital MRV, that's measurement, reporting, and verification. So think about, how does your digital product passport and carbon content and all of the life cycle assessments or impact assessments. It's embedded in what you're producing and what you're selling to the world and trading across boundaries. All of this not only creates transparency and value, but it's negotiating power. This is a shift. This is a paradigm shift, technology and intellectual transfer without the colonial baggage in the past. So it's really, really compelling. Closing question, James. We've explored tension, structures, models that have worked in the Namibia blueprint. Let's close this with, how does African sovereignty and global partnership coexist, not in theory, and what's your big bet for 2026?
Absolutely. So I think my big bet for 2026 entails me trying to answer this question of how does this African ambition and narrative exist with these geopolitical tensions, but also there's a certain amount of novelty as to where we are, right? Because people used to talk about the West, but at the moment the West is not necessarily always seeing eye to eye with the West. And I think that in itself is an amazing learning opportunity, right? For us Africans to kind of look at this and say, what does that actually mean? And what opportunity does that present me? So what I want to do, I spoke earlier in the podcast about codifying and then disaggregating industrialization. I think what the lessons I've gone through for the past 5 years, I think there's a way we can actually put together a formula that unlocks what that potential looks like. And so I want to try and put something I talked about this in the podcast, this African Sustainable Industrialization Institute. This is really what I'm going to try and push for in 2026. This is the value proposition. This is the sort of policy we think you can put in place in order to mobilize fit for purpose capital, which was obviously my background, asset management, institutional investors, banks. And then if you mobilize that sort of capital that is appropriately priced, we think the right industrial champions can be brought to bear in order to build sustainable, differentiated, and competitive industrial clusters. And when we're able to do this, I think it could be really, really impactful, right, for the African continent. Because what we were doing in Namibia, by the way, I'm now seeing Angola do this a lot more, right? I met the Sonangol team in Germany a few weeks ago. They're getting it. The Zambian Nitrogen Chemicals of Zambia has called me and said, could we put together a fertilizer plant? South Africa has now put in place a climate change act that is essentially an emissions trading scheme of its own, pretty much not to combat, but to complement CBAM, so that all of those taxes are collected in South Africa. So we're seeing African nations beginning to realize, right, the utility of green industrialization. However, not all African nations have the same level of resources to put in place such sophisticated policies, right? And even after you put that policy, articulating the utility of that policy to financiers and then to industrial champions is something that many people can do with some help. And so that's what I want to do for 2026. Africa has 54 countries, so you're not going to do all of them, but there are 2 or 3 I'll be looking forward to working with: Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Angola, Zambia, and a couple of Kenyas as well, Nigeria.
Wonderful.
And then really going from theory, Cherie, to actually, practical example. You take that iron ore granule that we will make with high iron, whether we end up using blockchain or something else to sort of really verify its quality, its carbon content, etc. And then you want to take that certificate, they call it sometimes a glue, and you want to make sure that iron ore, that DRI, fetches a higher price than a DRI that has been processed, with natural gas in Texas or somewhere else. And so that particular project, working with you guys, is something I want to get going as a practical example of what's possible. And we'll get that financed with, funds from climate investment funds, for example. That would be 4.5% versus our own national cost of 7 or 8% for the same sort of tenor, right? So 2026, That's what we're going to do. We're going to go from theory to practical and then knock it out the park, and remember to have lots of fun.
JG, final thoughts.
Yeah, I was just trying to think. It feels like there's an inevitability here for what you are doing and what other nations in Africa are doing. And I wonder if the real risk is not helping your fellow regional countrymen get ready for when the West, and I use that loose term, when the West finally realizes the clean energy movement isn't their primacy, right? So I wonder what is the key unlock for your surrounding regional countries to make sure that when the shutters finally fall from the West, Africa is ready in all respects? What is the global energy blend when we get to 2050 and we get to net zero? Because we don't do that without Africa, right? So what is the energy blend in your perspective? If you can navel gaze and kind of cast forward,
Navel
what is it
gaze.
from
I've never heard that.
a 2050 perspective?
I'll be like 65 years old or some shit like that. I'm like, oh my goodness. That's one prediction. So if I make it, inshallah, that's one prediction I can get you. Look, the truth of the matter is, there's a really interesting, I think, Ember has put out this paper called Electrotech Revolution. Everyone's enjoying it. And one of the things they're encouraging there is be careful about trying to solve 2050 problems with 2025 technology. What solar and batteries are doing today, they were just,
Yes.
it wasn't even a thing, right? In 2010, not to the extent that it is, right? And so you have to be humble enough to be willing to be nimble, right? In that, I think for the next 5-7 years, we have an amazing opportunity in Africa to use solar, to use battery. And by the way, if you're in Kenya, geothermal is a thing, and that may not be a thing in Namibia, right? But our wind assets in Namibia are very differentiated from Congo, Lesotho's hydro. So you have to use what you have, right? And then you have to make sure that you're embedding, I think, your ambitions with techno-economic, cutting edge information so that your policies actually make sense. In terms of 2050 or where we're going, one of the things that worry me, right, is I think we are at a tipping point potentially of real disruption for multi-billion dollar industries, right? And it's not like those guys are just going to sit there and watch like a whole new emerging world order just destroy what they say to me was their children's inheritance, right? So if your whole ecosystem is built on hydrocarbons, right, and some really innovative guys in China or Africa are effectively going to break that potentially over the next few decades, folks will react, right? And I think in preparing our African leaders or leaders across the world, but I'm focusing on Africa, you have to prepare them for that scenario as well. Is the reaction, the response, and how do you build resilience when folks write the IRA one day and tear it up the next day? And then we don't know what they will do 5 years from now, right? When that sort of noise is happening, how do you try to see through that and sort of see the learning curves that are going to be disruptive, and then make sure you make the right investment so you don't have stranded assets, but so that you make the right geopolitical call that is good for your national security, your energy independence, and then your industrial domination plan. That's key.
Wonderful. James, I appreciate you so much sharing with us today and carving out time. Anyone listening, corporates, financiers, rebels in the supply chain revolution, please get in touch with James. Please stack hands on this new regenerative clean energy revolution happening in Africa. And my friend, thank you so much. Have a wonderful holiday with your beautiful family.
Thank you, Sherry. We have a lot of work to do in 2026. I'll be counting on you too. Thanks everyone for listening.